All right, good deal. All right, sorry. Thank you guys for joining me for my talk. As I mentioned in the pre-show banner, I kind of sweaty. I was trying to work out and lose the quarantine 15 or whatever the slang word is for that. So anyways, if you've got questions, check out the Discord channel. We'd love to interact or answer questions if you've got those along the way. I'll try to glance over, but I am trying to sort of present and keep this engaging at the same time. So I try to keep up, but sometimes it doesn't quite happen. So real quick here, my name is Tim Medin. I am the principal consultant, one of the principal consultants at Red Siege. So we do pen testing, that kind of stuff. I also teach and am the lead author for the SANS 560 class, the class on penetration testing at SANS. I also teach the advanced pen testing course. INS faculty, the master's program director for the Masters of Engineering at SANS, and been pen testing for a long time. So I'd like to keep that as brief as possible, but a little bit of background there. So do we have any, by the way, I didn't check. So I did a presentation yesterday with the Black Hills folks, and I had a couple of typos because there was just like a lot of words, and they were giving me crap. So they're taking shots. So apparently that's the drinking game. If you find a typo in my presentation, go get some drinks. And hopefully it'll be less loaded than BB was yesterday. So anyways, I'm going to break this down. By the way, the slides are available if you want to grab the slides ahead of time. So if you go to redsiege.com/AB, where was that right there in the bottom left? If you want to grab those ahead of time, feel free to do so. Look ahead, and if it's not interesting to you, go do literally anything else, right? But anyways, the presentation, I'm sort of breaking it down into 4 pieces here, because the premise of this discussion is talking about why, I think the assume breach is a better model for pen testing and some of the limitations around pen testing. So we'll walk through what is our sort of traditional pen test, what is it focused on, what is the real world attacks, because our goal as offensive people is to model the real world attackers, right? Of course, the whole goal is to focus on the business risk. And if we're not, we are absolutely failing. I'm going to put those pieces together and sort of describe the sort of topic that I'm talking about, right? So first off, let's talk about what have we sort of traditionally been doing in our pen test, right? What has this sort of looked like, right? Here's a lovely scene from War Games, throwing in the old school reference, right? So our traditional pen test, we've got this sort of standardization around it. We've been doing it for a long time, but sort of the typical process that we see is, especially with an internal, is we plug into that internal network, right? That's where the pen test begins, where we take a laptop, we plug it into the inside of that network, we sit down and we perform testing, right? So the next step oftentimes is some scanning. We need to find the systems and services that are available. It could be as simple as doing an Nmap scan to find the services that are available. It could be very focused, where we're looking for specific services. It could be much broader. We want to find all of the services. Again, the key difference here is going to be that goal. Could be we fire up a vulnerability scanner. And so there's lots of discussions here about the different pieces here, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. But in general, this is kind of the early stages of our pen test, right? Next up, we do our sort of exploitation, and there could be a number of different things. It could be we find a service, we cross-reference it with the known vulnerabilities, we fire off the exploit, right? Hit the go button in Metasploit or whatever it may be, or it could be some sort of a traditional sort of password guessing, right? We get access to this SSH server, and now we can start guessing some of those passwords to get access to some of these systems. By the way, CloudStrike is giving me crap for the Green Bay colors in the background. I can't point. There it is. He says that alone makes him want to drink. I'm sorry, you must be a Bears fan there, huh, CloudStrike? Anyway, all right. So going back, so following logically with our traditional pen test and what we're doing here is there's some basic assumptions, right? For this to be a sort of a valid test, if you will, and represent a real attacker, given X, given that we do these steps, what do we sort of know to be true, right? Sort of what's the logical sort of steps here, right? So if we do our pen test and we plug into this network, we're sort of assuming that the attacker is on our network in some way, shape, or form to start with, right? Like network access, not, and the sort of confusing piece here is not on our network as a regular user, not on a Windows system, but probably some sort of random Linux system that just happens to be on the network, right? Which is probably not as much the case here, right? Where a bad guy physically walking into our facility, I'm not going to say it's not going to happen, but the number of bad guys who are going to walk into our facility, sit down, plug in, and not have some sort of additional access here is a little bit confusing, right? It also assumes that an attacker is going to get in and going to sort of get initial access, frankly, because they're on the network. They're going to get access by some sort of internal exposed network service. That's frankly not very realistic, is it, right? You're not going to have it. We were breached because we had this internal service running. No. That was probably an escalation or a pivoting method, not the initial access, right? And then, of course, access is gained through some exploit or some sort of internal password guessing, right? So this, if you look at this, you're like, well, crap, this doesn't make sense. This isn't what the real attackers are doing. Yeah, but that's what we're doing in our sort of traditional network pen tests, right? Given X, given the way that we perform these pen tests, these are sort of the logical things that we're assuming the bad guy is doing here, right? So, whoops. So we've got this faulty assumptions here, right? That the attacker is going to plug into the network. How are they getting into the network? Right? How are they getting into our network? Realistically, and we'll come to this in a little bit, they're not just plugging into our network, right? What is the answer? How are the bad guys getting into our network? I'm looking at the Slack channel here, or sorry, Discord channel. How are the bad guys getting in, right? The obvious answer here is, well, wait, I'm not sure how lagged we are. All right, we'll just say, obviously, phishing, right? This is how they're commonly getting in. We've performed some of these scans in our pen tests. Are attackers performing these noisy sort of scans? Right now, I get it. This is a little bit of a trade-off, right? This is a trade-off, speed versus accuracy, where we can be a lot louder and noisier sometimes, depending on the goals of our test, versus the attacker who has to go much lower and much slower. And then the exploits, right? Are they lobbing exploits anywhere? Realistically, no. Right? I mean, you ask any sort of pen tester, red teamer these days, and you ask them how they're getting access, and it's not going to be that, you know, MS 08067. There's still a couple of those floating around, but those types of flaws are sort of going away. The reliability of those exploits is going away. We're getting much better at our patch management process, right? So the question here is, when the attacker sort of starts, are they starting with access, or, you know, are they getting the access, right? That sort of goes back to that phishing thing. When they first start, in a way, they're starting with that initial access, right? Let's take a step back now. Let's take a look at what's really going on in the real world. So we talked about our traditional pen test. We talked about some of the basic assumptions we make with the process choices that we make with our pen tests. Let's look at the attacker actions, because that's our goal, right? As our pen testers, our goal is to mimic the real world bad guys, right? So let's first spend some time here talking about the insiders versus the outsiders. So insiders versus outsiders, right? This is from the 2019 Verizon Data Breach Report, where we've got 69% are outsiders, 34% are insiders. That's a significant number. In fact, when I compared that versus the previous year, to 2018, it was about 8 to 10%. I'm trying to remember the exact number, increase on the insiders. Now, if you look at these numbers and you add them up, you're like, Tim, that's more than 100, right? That's because sometimes they're actually working together. So, by the way, I'm loving the feedback here in the Slack. Bonus points to whoever decided to troll on the sports question by adding the reactions for football, baseball, soccer, all the other sports that were actually not football. Well done to whoever that is, right? So looking at the breach actions, this is actually based on the 2018 Verizon breach because it broke it out a little bit differently than the 2019 version. But if you look at item 1 and item 2, we've got use of stolen credentials and we've got phishing. Those are the top actions, right? So that phishing, that way we're getting into the organization, where we convince somebody to click on an email, install, give us credentials, right? We're also seeing a lot of course, of the credential stuffing, where a credential is stolen at one place and then it's reused someplace else, right? Like I use this same password at some crappy website, it's breached. Someone gets those password hashes, cracks them, and now starts to use those everywhere else, right? So if we go back now and think about our traditional pen test, our initial access, our initial tests don't start with these stolen credentials, right? It doesn't start with this sort of a phish. To take it sort of even further, and this is an interesting sort of a split here. This is from the 2019 Verizon breach report. We've got phishing and use of stolen creds are the top breach actions. And you'll actually see way down at the bottom is exploiting vulnerabilities, right? Way down at the bottom. That is a very small number, right? And I'm going to bring up that point here in just a little bit. Remember that phishing and use of stolen creds is way at the top, and that exploit vulnerability is way down at the bottom. Remember, most of the bad guys are lazy. They're going to use somebody else's tools and techniques because they work, right? They're not going to be writing necessarily their own O-Day. And there's some, of course, debate whether we should on the offensive side. There was a question in one of these chats a little bit earlier about that. Hopefully we can bring some of these up here. So some of the phishing stats, right? Of course, we see the phishing increasing, going up all the time. Why? Because it works, right? Even if we get these numbers better and better, we're never going to get to a case where it's 100% that people don't click the links. People have to do their job. We had an interesting discussion in a Slack channel I have with some very sharp friends, and we were talking about sort of responding to the phishing links and whether we should or shouldn't, and it was a whole long, interesting discussion. I mean, there's only so much you can do to try to prevent those links from coming in and then responding after it's already in, right? Because there's just going to be so many. Someone is guaranteed going to click that link, and trying to get that to zero realistically isn't feasible, right? So we'll kind of come back to that again in just a little bit, but it should, of course, shows that the key, the important pieces here with phishing. Another interesting blog post, the FireEye folks did this, but it laid out some of the real world attack scenarios. What is the sort of typical process? And this is very similar to that when I've talked to other red teamers, other pen testers, very, very similar process, right? Phish, pivot through systems, escalate privileges, and access the high value systems, right? So just talking through that, of course, obligatory Kerberoasting reference. By the way, if you want to check out a talk on Kerberoast, I did one yesterday. So anyway, so we talked through some of the basics here on how a traditional pen test work. We talked through some of the pieces here with what the real bad guys are doing. Of course, the whole goal for us as the good guys, the people trying to keep the bad guys out, is we're here to make the business more secure, right? Our goal is to focus on that business risk and frankly, reduce that business risk. One of the key discussions, now this is sort of maybe a little bit off topic, breaking the fourth wall or whatever. If you're hiring pen testers, red teamers, whatever you want to call them, or you are the pen testers, red teamers, whatever, it's always so important to focus on the business risk, right? I ask that all the time. I ask all the time, the first question I ask, and I do this mostly to level set, what data or process, if lost, stolen, compromised, or whatever, would cause the biggest issues to your organization, right? So we've got to focus on that. We've got to focus on that. It was actually a client that was talking to like maybe 2 weeks ago that kind of sticks out in my mind. I asked him, I'm like, what data, if lost, stolen, compromised, or destroyed, would cause the biggest risk to your organization? And I was talking to a technical folks. He said, oh, domain admin access. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I get that, but technically that's one step away, isn't it? Right? That's one step away. The key piece here is you need to take the data, right? If the bad guys get domain admin and that's it, what's the point? Right? They have something that they're trying to exfil, something they're trying to maybe destroy, something they're trying to do. And that domain admin is simply a method, simply a way to accomplish those tasks, right? So I asked this question because I never want to assume. If I assume, I could be wrong. So ask the dumb questions, and frankly, just frame it that way. What I say here is on the screen. I can guess, but I don't like to be wrong. So if you would take a minute, could you describe what data, if lost, stolen, compromised, or destroyed, would cause the greatest impact to your organization, right? And that's an important question here to ask, because again, I don't want to be wrong. 99 times out of 100, I talk to an organization and they'll be like, well, Tim, it's obviously the credit cards. Like, okay, cool. I don't want to be wrong. So I would rather ask the question than miss focus, than not focus on the goal. And the reason is, I learned this a number of years ago, fortunately. There was a sort of like a big, kind of think of like an Amazon, if you will, but they sold tools, right? They had like a wrench that was like a meter long. I'm like, oh, sweet, I want this wrench. And it was like $1,000. I'm like, I don't really need that wrench. I mean, I want it, but I'm not going to pay $1,000 for it. But I asked them, I'm like, what data, lost, stolen, compromised, etc., would cause the greatest risk? And in my mind, I'm running through this list of things like, customer data, financial information, information about the employees, bank accounts, right? Like I'm running through this list, and a number of you are probably running through a very, very similar list here, thinking the same sorts of things, right? The thing that came back and told me was, well, the most critical thing for us is the price at which we sell things. I was like, what? And many of you are probably sitting at home watching this like, wait, it was a website, right? Yeah, it was a website. The prices were all online, right? And the biggest concern to them was somebody else getting their pricing. I was like, I mean, it's all online. Like, do I need to explain to you how the internet works, how websites work, right? How the Facebook works, right? Like I was baffled. But I asked the question, like, okay, tell me more. And they told me then that the reason why this was so important to them was because if a competitor was able to get all the pricing, they could sell everything for like a cent less and they would go out of business. I was like, huh, I had never thought about that. I'm glad I asked this question, or else I could have been wrong, right? And it turns out during the course of that pen test, we came across that data. And had I not asked that question, I would have seen that data and been like, I don't care, not interesting to me, right? And then all of the risks surrounding the vulnerabilities that got us to that point, to that critical data that I didn't know existed, would have been miscategorized, right? I wouldn't have had a good, accurate representation around that. So it's always important to have those goals, whether it is a red team, pen test, assume breach. And again, make them business goals, not technological goals, right? Domain admin is cool, but domain admin gives you access to the data. We'll come back to some of that in a little bit and why that's so important, especially with an assumed breach, right? That domain admin is a tool, not a destination. I love that quote. I don't know who initially said it. I sort of attribute that to, I think it was Jeff McJunkin maybe that said something like that. By the way, we've got some a couple of things that Justin's going to post here. Actually, Mike Saunders, one of the guys on my team, and I actually did a whole presentation on hacking without domain admin and the cool things that you can do sort of related to that. Okay, right? So that sensitive data, the key here is to remember is people think they need domain admin. They very much don't, right? Sensitive data can be compromised without administrative access, and especially without domain administrative access, right? Every user in your organization probably has access to some kind of sensitive data, one way, shape, or form. So all I need access is a single user. If you think about it, the attacker doesn't need all the bank accounts. They don't need all the credit card numbers, right? With bank account numbers, there's oftentimes going to be large sums of money in it. It doesn't take many of those accounts to make a significant amount of money. I was doing a pen test, this was a while ago now. They were locked down hard. Internal, it was brutal. But we found that there was data all over the place. Large financial institution where you had to be quite wealthy to even knock on the door. I don't need all of the account numbers. I need a couple of those, right? And get millions of dollars and live comfortably, frankly, for the rest of my life, right? So we'll come back to some of that as well. So let me sort of sell you on the case on the assumed breach. And I know there's a lot of this isn't meant to be a sales pitch in any way, shape, or form. I think most pen testing companies and security companies are doing things, or at least have an offering this way as well. I know for a fact that a number of the people that I see in here are doing the exact same sorts of things. But what I'm trying to do here is make the case for why this makes more sense than doing your sort of a traditional test here, right? So let's take a quick step back here and let's get a little bit more philosophical. So there's a Harvard Business Review discussion around ways to improve your decision making. There's a significant overconfidence bias where, hey, blank or blank is going to stop us, right? But what if it doesn't, right? And this is a great point sort of in the world we're living in when things go sideways, right? And the black swan hits. This is a very common issue where people have those overconfidence and they overbelieve that something is going to protect them. Frankly, it's more common in men. Look around the industry, right? We have way more men, and this isn't any sort of like, man bashing. This is from the assignments from Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman did this research. Men, particularly wealthy and experts, tend to be more overconfident. So it's universal. So check this, right? Like, so let's assume that, hey, we don't have our AV, our EDR, or whatever. That piece is going to fail, right? Now what? Right? What happens when this piece fails? Let's check the next sort of piece. When these attacks are successful, right? When the bad guys are successful and they get in, how does it work? Right? And we think so many times, we hear this time and time again. Has it happened here? Oh no, but it happens to everybody else. It's only a matter of time before it does happen to you. So think about the probability and then don't exclude yourself. Like if you think about like what's the probability it will happen to somebody else, you probably come up with a number and then force that number on yourself. Because people have this weird split where like, oh, it's going to happen to somebody else, but it'll never happen to us. Why? Why are you special? Frankly, you're not, right? When we think about some of that access, I had a lovely discussion with Bryson. He's presenting right now. In fact, I would be at his presentation right now if I wasn't here. But we had a nice discussion around 0-day for initial access versus not. My sort of opinion is like this, and don't get me wrong, there are reasons why it is important. But what are we focusing on here, right? If you're using the 0-day as a way into your organization, you're saying you have to land with that 0-day to get the initial access. We're focusing a little bit more on the shell of the egg than the yolk, right? If I can't crack that egg, then the yolk is totally fine, right? But go back, right? Go back and say, well, wait, what happens if we do? What happens if we actually do crack that egg? And I see this time and time again, right? And writing O-days, it's expensive, right? It's hard here. Let me sort of jump forward a little bit. Writing the O days is difficult. It's expensive, and they disappear very quickly when they're found. Right? We find a really bad bug. People get. I'm not saying it just disappears. I'm just saying that they're burned very, very quickly. So, and I was talking to Bryson. He was talking to a very large corporation. They're like, no, we need 0 days. Why? Do you want to pay extra so someone writes the 0 days and uses it in your network when realistically we can recreate the exact same thing for less? Right? And it's not about saving money. It's about using your money wisely. Why are you going to spend extra time for people to use a 0 day to get into your organization when you could perform the same sort of test and sort of seed that initial access and then spend money on defenses, spend money on people, right? Spend on other things that are going to help you actually defend. Because what I oftentimes see is people think, oh, well, we caught the O day. Cool. What happens when you don't? Right? What happens when this doesn't work? Right? And if we take this step back and we look at this sort of much more broadly, the bad guys are getting in, and they're getting in and they have access for 5 to 6 months. We've got to reduce this, right? I sort of joke, and it's sort of not a joke, but I get people, I mean, Red is in our company name, right? Red Siege. And they ask, hey, do you want a red team? And I will almost always try to change them and convince them to do something else. And the reason is, realistically, do they actually want a red team or they just want the buzzword? I don't say it because that sounds condescending, right? Because someone heard this term and now they need it, but realistically, do they? The key here is, what are you trying to test? I want to make sure that you are trying to test the right thing. And I'm not saying the red team is never the right answer. No way. I'm just saying for the vast majority of organizations, we need to slowly ratchet up that security. And we get a false sense of hope if during the red team that's constrained to a few weeks or whatever, somebody can or can't get in, there's a misunderstanding for what the risk is, right? How much time would a real bad guy spend to get into your organization if the payout might be tens of millions of dollars? Right now, multiply that where if the bad guy lives in a third world country with no extradition laws, right? The risk is essentially zero. Their reward is, I never have to work again, right? So assume breaks. Let's just concede. Let's concede that the attacker has the initial access, right? Again, we're saving time, right? I love red teams, but oftentimes up front, we're spending a lot of time trying to get that initial access. There's a lot of time where we throw an email in and we wait, right? We wait till Sally gets back from a coffee break, or Steve gets back from lunch, right? We don't know if it's been caught one way or another, and it's just a lot of waiting. I find it to be inefficient for the vast majority of people because it's, again, frankly, not what we're going to need, right? So we can see that sort of access. Now, the other sort of piece here is when the bad guys get in, they start with access. Right? This is not dropping a laptop on the network. This is starting on the network as if one of your users is compromised, right? As if they have sold out and they're a spy, right? And you can sort of sell it that way too and say, look, you know what? We can do both. This is a phishing test, but we can also spin this as, what happens if we have a rogue insider, right? If you remember the stats from before, the insider here was a pretty decent number, right, for these various compromises. So it does a number of things, and of course, focus on the data here. Mike, actually, one of my colleagues at Red Siege, wrote a lovely blog post. I love this blog post, where he's talking about focusing on the actual goal. This was a test that we were on, and we got our butts handed to us technologically, right? It was quite difficult. But what he did was able to focus on that data, and we found important data lying all over the place. Now, did we get DA in this one? No, we didn't. And it was tough, and I hate when that doesn't happen, right? Because we want that technical win or that pen tester win, but realistically, the data is the key here. And we found, bank accounts and routing numbers. By the way, this is all fake data, and we've changed the details to protect the innocent here. But it sort of recreates that scenario where we're focusing on the particular data, right? So think about this, right? Attacker gets into the organization. Let's say your organization, your IP is maybe sensitive drawings, right? That's your intellectual property. This is the piece that you need to make your business successful. It could be a financial institution where it's bank accounts, routing numbers, credit cards, whatever it might be. Users on your network are going to have access to this data, right? And if the bad guys land on that, in that first example, if they land on that engineer's system and they have access to the drawings, they don't need to pivot. They don't need to escalate. They definitely don't need domain admin, right? They definitely don't need this because it's already there. If you phish, maybe someone in finance got access to all sorts of financial information. You phish HR. HR opens PDFs and Word documents all day long. Probably a lot of social security numbers in there, right? So we don't have to necessarily focus on the technological game. Focus, once again, that sensitive data, right? The great things we can do, some great ways we can sort of test this out. I love the the file finder. There's oh shoot, I didn't update that link, but there's the find interesting files, which is sort of supersedes this. I forgot to update this slide. Actually, I did, just in a different copy. But these two sort of used together, we can look for file shares with sensitive information. I mean, they're called file shares because they share files, right? And there's oftentimes sensitive data. Finance teams will be sharing, and it could be our file share is SharePoint, right? And users are going to have access to that. And if you've ever tried to manage a file share or frankly SharePoint, I can guarantee you it's oversharing. Because I mean, I've got like and I don't have a a total sample, but every single time I've looked, I found more data out in that thing than there should be, more widely shared than it should be. Other interesting things, and this goes back to some of that pwnage without DA. A great blog post here from Sean Metcalf. I'm a Sean Metcalf fanboy, by the way. The link is in the bottom corner here. But this, look on sysvol for credentials. Will it give you credentials to necessarily escalate? Maybe not. But it might give you credentials that allow you to map a share and now get access to that sensitive data, right? The good old GPP, another great one there. Is this feature technically disabled? Sure. Are there a lot of them that's still out there? Yes. Mike did it last week, literally. So some great tools related to that and PowerSplit. A number of great tools there with PowerSplit. Other one, I've got to throw this out there because everybody sort of will say, well, Tim, you didn't actually talk about Kerberoasting. Well, there it is. Again, if you want more details on the Kerberos, I literally did a talk yesterday with the Black Hills folks where we go into much more detail on Kerberos in general, what you can do with Kerberoasting. Short answer is with Kerberoasting, I can use this as a way to maybe access additional services. It's also an escalation technique as well, right? Other things we can, of course, do, password spray. I can use, I'm going to switch over here to my favorite tool written by Bo Bullock, invoke domain password spray. There's another of these other ones out here as well. Once we have that initial access, start looking around for other users, right? And it doesn't have to be escalation, right? Because if I land on marketing person's computer, what happens now if I get the credentials now for someone in finance? We were doing a test, this was a number of years ago now, where did this exact sort of spraying sort of technique, and we got the director of HR. And we told them, like, look, I've got the credentials for the director of HR. And they're like, stop, you can't use those. So, I mean, oh, okay. They're like, look, you just can't, because we realize at this point, if you started sending things from HR, right, people are gonna click on them like crazy, and we know the game is over. We concede defeat here, try something else. I'm like, oh, well, okay, I sort of understand. I just wanna make sure that you have the discussion with the head of HR on, this is a bad idea, right? And I'm not gonna go into the whole list of bad passwords, right? That's a rant you've probably heard many a time. Mailbox permissions, right? Maybe you've got access to a shared folders. Shared folders have extra information, access to somebody else's mailbox. We'll find passwords. People email sensitive data all the time. Look for the sensitive data inside of those mailboxes. Again, this is not getting domain admin. This is looking around for the data that's already there, right? Everyone thinks that they need to get into the giant vault to get all the data, but there's gold sprinkled all over the place. You can just pick up some of those pieces, right? So great tool here, written once again by Bo Bullock at by the folks over at Black Hills. So that is going to wrap it up. Let's take some questions. So let's see some questions here. I was trying to keep up with the questions in the channel, and they were scrolling by a little bit fast, and maybe I'm in the wrong channel. Let's see. What do we got for questions?
Okay, let's see. I think CloudStrike had some questions, but I think you answered. Are you suggesting, well, he had one here. Are you suggesting to apply a firewall methodology to structured and unstructured data sources?
What methodology?
Firewall methodology?
I don't understand that question.
Yeah, I'm having a time parsing that myself. CloudStrike, if you could rephrase that for us, that would be fantastic. The Laughing Man posted a long question. I don't know if you want to.
I see that. Yeah, let me address that. So the Laughing Man in the Discord, I'm not read all of it because I don't read fast enough, but I think the gist is the issue is he's seeing is selling it to the C-level, right? Because the C-level wants to make it look like the real world, right? And it's misguided, right? Where we're spending too much time on that sort of initial access and that you must use real ODay and not focusing on those additional layers, right? Where we're focusing on the shell of the egg, where we also need to make sure that we've got protections inside to protect the yolk once that shell is cracked, right? I totally get that. I'm having that exact same struggle, Laughing Man. The phishing campaign, what I like to do sort of to add to that is break it up, right? Let's see what happens. Let's break this up. Let's do some payload testing. Let's email some payloads in. Let's see what percentage sort of make it through. Let's do maybe a phishing campaign where we try to get credentials. What percentage of users give us credentials? But more importantly, what percentage of users report, right? Because that's an important metrics. We're always going to have people who are going to give it up, but if we can have those additional helpers essentially working as an IPS and IDS inside of our network to shut this kind of thing down quickly, that's great, right? And then so we're testing sort of that initial access, and then we can jump to the assume breach and say, okay, let's assume something lands, and now let's go. Because another scary thing, and I'm sure it's happened to a lot of us too as pen testers, is you do the phishing, you've got the payload, you send this thing in, and I've had shell on someone's home computer because they emailed it to themselves. And that's panic, right? Because I don't technically have authorization to do so, but they forwarded their work email, and now I'm sort of out of scope. Or I was allowed to test specific users in the organization. Now they've forwarded it to somebody else, and now I'm sort of out of scope. So it's sort of, I like to split those pieces up. Kind of related to that too is maybe when we get that initial access, do like a command and control. Once we have access, can you detect the CNC? Can you detect data exfil, right? So someone trying to grab this data and then send it outside the organization. So I hope that answers your question and then more.
Rafael Mota on GoToMeeting says, sorry for my bad English and I'm drinking, but testing. So testing our respond and recovery time of our blue team. What do you think to define our goal is like get a domain app? Okay, I think what he's trying to say here is in terms of testing the blue team's response and recovery time, could getting domain admin be a valid goal in that sense?
I mean, I think so, but I think it's still a little bit misguided, right? Like if you're trying to keep me out of the vault, cool, but what happens if I don't go for the vault, right? Like, because the key here is to defend the data. You're defending the tool that gets me to the data. So it's on the right path, but a little bit different, right? Like I can use a car to get from the point A to point B. What happens if I walk instead, right? The key is getting to that final destination, not the way I necessarily get there. So yes, I mean, I'm not saying don't do it. Just remember the framework in which you're doing it.
Awesome. And also a question from
Marcello, by the way, you've probably got tons of insight here as well. I mean, Field, if you've got things to add, my gosh, please feel free to answer.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, I 100% agree with you in terms of like, definitely domain admin should almost never be the goal on a red team, no less. Like the main goal of a red team should be trying to get access to what the company deems to be business critical, right? So whether that be, I don't know, like patents or PII or whatever, credit card data, or whatever the company, like whatever would hurt the most to a company if it got leaked, breached, or whatever, that should definitely be the goal, right? Or what they would assume, according to their threat model, like what targets would be wanting to acquire from that company. So I mean, I 100% agree with you. And the great thing about this methodology is also that it brings so much more value to the customer in so many more ways, just because of like, hey, if you hand your C-level executive like, hey, we got domain admin, he or she is probably gonna be like, okay, well, I don't know what the hell that is, but okay, sure, I'll trust you. But if you hand them a report saying, hey, we got access to credit cards, like social security numbers, your private patents, that kind of thing, and now that's what really makes their eyes open and see, okay, we have a serious problem here. Let's dedicate some resources to fix that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. There's one. So Ops Typo has a great point here, whether he knows it or not, or she or whomever. They finally did the test, and then IT never got back to him because they felt intimidated. This is a problem, and I'm sure, and we've all seen this, where the blue team looks as the red team is opposite. In fact, I'm wearing my purple team shirt here, right? Because we're on the same team. The only reason that red, offense, pen, whatever you want to call it, the only reason we exist is to make the defensive and defenders and defenses better. And if we sort of show up, shame them, and leave, we're doing them a significant disservice. And it's a cultural issue many times where we show up and we do this, and they don't want us to find things, right? Because it's a waste of time. Why are we doing this? The goal is to find those issues so we can lock them down. So when the real bad guys show up, everything is locked down. We've made it harder. We've increased their dwell time, increased the likelihood of catching them, right? And I hate this adversarial thing. It's a big problem on the blue side, and frankly the red, because we've kind of been like that, where we do the wham bam thank you ma'am and leave, right? But it's got to be more collaborative. We are on the same team.
Yeah, I personally love the purple team approach. The purple team approach is where it's at, and it also depends on the mindset. It also depends on the mindset of both the people working in the offense side and people working in the defensive side. Sometimes the company culture of your client also tends to influence a lot of the testing involved. So it's a complex problem. I definitely agree. And also, we got a lot of questions rolling in. Actually, we have time for a bunch. Have you thought about doing a risk appetite analyst before each job? I'm not sure, Trent. I'm not sure what your question there is. Maybe if you can rephrase that. I'm having a hard time understanding what you meant by that. But while Trent's doing that, we have a question from James who says, how often do you get IP whitelists for your C2 servers to avoid going out of scope?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily, I don't think that necessarily matters. It would be, well, I kind of see what you're saying. Very rarely, to answer your question. I'm sort of fill that question out for some of those who might be wondering, what the heck is he talking about? My understanding of the question is, so I would set up my C2 server and it only receives connections from very specific IP addresses. So maybe it's coming from just their corporate network, right? But I mean, I like that, but I also don't, because what if someone takes that laptop and they're in the coffee shop, right? And it also doesn't reduce the risk if someone inside the organization who is in scope forwards that now to someone who is out of scope, right? So it can save you a little bit, but not necessarily, or frankly, you know, maybe they've got a VPN on their home computer and they're using that to get in. It can be difficult.
Yep, definitely. I personally have never, I don't think I've ever had a client specifically ask me to whitelist IP address on the server. So, I mean, that's just my experience at least. Awesome talk. Question from Discord from PTR01. My question that you already touched upon, what is the difference between an internal infrastructure pen test versus a red team? Does a red team have to include initial compromise, or can you assume breach and still call it such?
Yeah, so, I mean, the sort of simple, I mean, there's a lot of nuance here, and there's, you know, this could be a whole talk, a whole panel, a whole discussion, a whole religious debate. But I break down the difference between a pen test and a red team as, in a pen test, you're testing the defenses. With a red team, you're testing the defenders, right? So the pen test, you're testing much more the technology. We're oftentimes going much faster, whereas the red team, we're going slow, and we're trying to test the detection capabilities and the ability of the blue team to respond in a timely manner. Now, the assume breach can sort of be in the middle there, depending on what you want. We did one with an organization where it was much more on the red side. In fact, they had an internal team member that was spawning shells internally for us to sort of simulate that initial access and to save time, right? I mean, it saved them, you know, plenty of time on additional recon, the additional initial payload and such, you know, tens of thousands of dollars, frankly. And he would just start spawning shells. And then in that case, it was much more like a red team approach. We've done it, of course, in the opposite, where we sit down, we plug in, and we're testing. It's much more on the pen. We've done it where we've sat down and much more closely interacted with the blue team, so we can say, hey, what are you seeing here? What's the visibilities? It could be sort of along those same lines where we're testing some of the payloads, like, hey, if I drop this, does it actually catch an alert? Cool. And sort of do a purple team kind of thing that way. So I think the assume breach kind of fits in the middle a little bit more. I mean, again, this is a giant debate, I'm absolutely sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trent actually got back and rephrased the question. So, have you thought about doing a risk appetite analysis? That's what he meant. Before each job. I have found companies may not know what they should be protecting. Yeah, that's a very good point, Trent. I found that too. I personally, I think we, at least at Black Hills, we sort of take care of that during the initial ROE call. So we have a rules of engagement call with the customer, and we ask them, hey, so we're doing a red team. What is, what do you think you should be protecting? Exactly that question. What do you want us to go after? That kind of thing. Yep. Tim, feel free to chime in, and you probably do something similar.
No, absolutely the same thing. But to that point as well, there's so many that don't know what they need. I heard the analogy. We had this discussion a number of years ago. This was I didn't have this pen test, so this is no client information. But it was we're talking about the Super Bowl, right? And what would be the worst thing? And we were thinking sort of initially sort of misguided approach as well. You could take the whole thing offline. Cool. What if you could replace the ads, right? What if you could put inappropriate things up during the Super Bowl, right? You got to sort of think outside the box. We can help them to a point, thinking like the bad guy, but if they don't know what their sensitive data is, I mean, that's a tough discussion. We try to tease that out, but if they don't know, we can only take that sort of so far. And that, frankly, that's a big sort of internal discussion that they have to have prior to this to understand what their sensitive data is. And frankly, related to that too, they oftentimes don't know where it is, because I've found sensitive data, I'm sure you have too, Marcello, all sorts of different places. And you're just that wasn't supposed to be there.
If I had a nickel for every time I found something and the client was like, oh, that shouldn't be there, oh my, I would have nickels by now. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And Zeller in Discord says, congrats on the talk. Which metric would you say is more important for the blue team? Time to detect or time to mitigate? That's a good question.
I mean, I think the key piece would be the time to detect. I mean, that's the more the time to detect, because right now we're missing so magnificently, right? The bad guys are in for 5 to 6 months, and it's not even that the people are eventually detecting it themselves. Some third party is detecting it, right? If a if a retailer is compromised, it's the credit card company who finds the breach for them, right? That time to detect, now time to mitigate, that's a whole different thing, because to kick the bad guys out, that's a very coordinated process to work with IR, because what you really realistically need to do is oftentimes slam all those doors at the same time, and that can take time to sort of coordinate. The detection time is super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have time. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna chime in, like that was something that we took into account recently in an op for the company I work for. Their logging's honestly not that bad, but we basically went from 0 to our end objective, which in this case was just owning as many domains as possible, and it was just a race. Like, we weren't concerned so much with not having the best OPSEC, because we knew we could go from, we could take over everything before they would be able to react. And at that point, like, you have persistence everywhere that it doesn't even matter. And that's what we were trying to show them. So
yeah,
sometimes, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, I was gonna say, sort of, I'll jump back to you. I cut you off, but I took the mic back, so I'll just go. We're talking like a large sort of entertainment company, and we're like, so how would you detect a breach? And they're like, probably a terabyte goes. We're like, wait, what? Like, that's how much stuff would have to leave to hit that threshold? Because they have so many massive pipes. Like, the data's already gone. You haven't detected it, right? It's like you've driven a U-Haul out of my front yard. It's like, oh crap, well that sucks. What do we do now, right? It's kind of too late. Go back and answer some more. Did I cut you off?
Oh no, I'm good. I'm good.
Right?
Yeah. No, but I'm good.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more questions. AC84B asks, have you been in a situation where you were not able to find anything, assuming we live in Alice in Wonderland? How do you then provide value to the client and actually realistically provide them feedback on their business risk?
Yeah, the short answer is no. There was always something laying around. Even the ones that were exceptionally hard. That one talk by Mike that I sort of highlighted. Let me just jump back. There's a short link somewhere, I'm sure. Check out the blog post. But this was an important one where he got shut down hard from the technological escalation technique, but there was still some data floating around. Was it everything? No. Was it enough where they would have to disclose they were breached and large quantities of money would be gone? Absolutely. And that stuff is littered all over the place. People are going to copy stuff to their desktop to do their work. They need access to these systems, the permissions to keep them right, especially as it's sort of the cruft develops, if you will, is going to be quite difficult. Justin just posted the link in the Discord, Red Team questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. And
so you have thoughts on that one way or the other? On that question, by the way? You too?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Did you guys have thoughts on that, by the way? The getting access?
Yeah. I think I don't know, but yeah, we'll figure it out. Is the Drew asks in GoToWebinar, is the speaker a Green Bay Packer fan?
Absolutely. You can see my cheese head up there, the stripes. There's a helmet here signed by Favre, Bart Starr, Aaron Rodgers, a bunch of other people, McCarthy, Sterling Sharp. I forget who's on it.
And one more from CloudStrike. Let me just check that there aren't any more in Red Team talks. Perfect. Okay, one more from CloudStrike to clarify. Insiders have access. I think you are recommending to Red Teams with access to test data defense. So to defend data, are you suggesting to move the perimeter around the data? Segmentation, microsegmentation, securing or firewalling ODBC connections or link servers, internal transmissions, MFA on data sources, etc. So I think the question is, so to defend data, are you suggesting to move the perimeter around the data as opposed to the current methodology of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing, right? Like, I mean, we've been talking about that for a long time. I very much agree with you, CloudStrike. get your defenses as close to the data as possible. And now when someone's trying to access a large quantity of it, that's a problem. And this is, of course, I say this in a couple of sentences, this is non-trivial. But when this data now is being moved to end user systems, that's a problem, right? If the finance person is copying this big database or giant Excel sheet to their desktop and is leaving with it, that's going to be a problem, right? So as much as we can restrict that data itself and track its movement, that of course is going to be super, super important.
Awesome. And I think that's all the time we have for the questions, but awesome talk, Tim, as usual, sir. And yeah, we'll get ready for the next one. And remember, I will boot you out. Don't leave the webinar just so.
You can kick Justin out too. We're here together.
Yeah, I'll kick both of you out. Okay.
Oh, it's like that?
Yeah, I know, right? Thanks for coming, man. See ya.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Hey, thanks you guys for attending the talk. If you've got questions, hit me up on the Twitters. Shameless plug, I'm really close to 10,000 and I so badly want to break that. But also, if you've got questions, hit me up with on the tweeters and I'll try to respond to you.
Also, Tim, I think someone pointed this out already, but on your slides, on your slides here, Red Siege is spelled wrong on the bottom there. Slides in Discord. Slides is Red Siege.
I'm already looking to buy redsidge.com.
Redsiege.com.
This is 2 days in a row. I had one yesterday where it was 2 E's, and the Black Hills guys were like, "Hey, I bought the domain for you real quick."
Awesome. Okay, thank you guys. Justin, you're going first. Sorry, buddy.
Nice. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good one.